but that you don't have to dive in all the way to exposing yourself to the things that you feel are very anxiety provoking. It can be something that's progressive.
The intersection of psychology and workplace functioning. We're going to have an awesome topic today with Irma, who is a Tampa. She's in Miami. She's all over Florida, crushing it in the mental health space. Irma, thank you for joining a mental health break.
Thank you for having me, Vincent. It's such an honor to be here today with you. So I'm super excited to talk a little bit more today about that intersection between psychology, the workplace, and leadership.
Oh, I can't wait. It's a unique perspective to bring to the show, plus her own personal story. But everyone, welcome back to A Mental Health Break. Thank you for continuing to tune in and make this show a top 5% global podcast. I appreciate you for coming each week and the amazing guests like Irma who take time out of their day to join our community. If this is your first show with us, welcome. This is the #1 podcast for mental health advocates, and here we normalize the conversation on mental health. Today's show is brought to you by theempathyset.com, John Ford's empathy card set. He has an app in the App Store. Go check those out. And, of course, Coming Alive podcastproduction.com. But today's amazing guest has her doctorate in counseling psychology over from UF. Even though I'm a Miami fan, it's an incredible accomplishment. And she's developing her experiences and integrating psychological research into her practice with a social justice lens. Again, she really focuses on the psychology and workplace functioning intersection. But before we get to that, Irma, I always like to ask our guests to share their story related to mental health, wherever you feel comfortable, maybe what led you into your work.
Yeah, always a great question, right? And so many layers, certainly, to that. I think a lot of it started very young for me, really recognizing that not everyone had access to equity in terms of healthcare, equity in terms of other spaces, but certainly realizing that. So I grew up in an area where sometimes there wasn't a lot of representation of diverse providers, healthcare providers in particular. So seeing the need there certainly started to stimulate that interest and wanting to be able maybe to connect with diverse populations on the provider side for me was a big motivator. I'll also say, I think we've all experienced some level of distress, for me in particular, some level of grief and loss in terms of just family and the loss within my family, and kind of working through that really allowed me to recognize the depths and the importance really of our mental health and how it impacts all facets of our life, including workplace functioning. So I think many layers, many different factors, but a big part is my own kind of journey with grief and loss and how that impacted mental health, as well as also wanting to provide, hopefully, equitable healthcare as a provider. And so here we are after that very long journey.
I love that. I'm typing in the notes, the goal of providing equitable healthcare. I mean, it's a challenge, especially as an entrepreneur, where you don't have this corporate insurance they're giving you. And now the insurance is slowly getting better that I have for myself, but it's still very limited, especially in mental health, where getting a psychologist or a therapist or whatever is not really feasible in many cases. So one of the main motivators for starting this show back in 2020 before COVID was my own therapy sessions. In a way, each week I get to sit down with someone. We talk about our mental health vulnerably to help other people. And to me, it does a great service. So I really appreciate you coming on this week. And who in your practice, who in your practice do you serve? Who do you help the most? Do you target a specific age group?
Great question. Yeah, so we serve a wide range of populations. A big part of who we serve are neurodivergent populations, in particular those who experience ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, learning disorders. So individuals who are quote unquote neurodivergent. So we will oftentimes conduct testing, assessments. We'll also conduct some coaching in the space of executive functioning. So we see in that space children ages 4 up until ages 65 for testing and assessments, as well as we'll also serve individuals who are experiencing anxiety disorders, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, social anxiety disorder. So a range of concerns within teens and then adults for psychotherapy in particular. So wide range of populations, but those are some areas of specialty. I certainly I identify strongly as a Latina American, so I'm always happy to also serve culturally diverse populations. I try to provide, like I said, dismantle some barriers to accessing, in particular, mental health care. So one of those ways is to provide services in Spanish and English as well. And then when we can, using like interpreter services for other clients as well. So those are some ways in which we serve just a wide range of populations.
Well, congratulations on being able to help so many people. I know starting, it wasn't always like that. Let's go back to when you first were getting your practice underway here. What is
Mm-hmm.
the process like for you to be
Mm-hmm.
able to offer testing? Are you just allowed to offer it, or do you have to get
Mm-hmm.
certifications, or walk our
Mm-hmm.
aspiring healthcare practice
Yeah.
owners out?
Yeah, awesome question. I'm not often asked that. So, in particular, you do have to have a license, at least in the state of Florida, as a psychologist, generally speaking, right? There are kind of some exceptions. You can also be a school psychologist, but many of us are licensed like clinical psychologists. So, we have a counseling or clinical psychology degree, either a PsyD or a PhD. And then you also do have to have training specifically in those assessments that you're administering, as well as the process of diagnosing. So understanding, for example, the diagnostic criteria, understanding differential diagnoses, understanding the kind of nuances of how to differentiate different disorders one from another, as well as just kind of general life stressors. And then, like I shared, the training in particular with specific assessments. Some assessments do require some particular certification, and then those certain levels of education too that are required in order to even just be able to administer some of it. But certainly, yeah, the training is key, supervision is key. I would say if you're interested in testing, try to do it sooner rather than later, like in your
Right.
journey as a graduate student. Being able to get some experience under your belt is fantastic, especially as a supervisee, so you can learn and just kind of gather that insight, as well as then even kind of postdoctoral training in particular too. So for example, there are postdoctoral programs in neuropsychology which
Sure.
focus heavily on neuropsychological assessments.
Well, you're doing amazing work, and I can't wait to see it all continue to unravel now that we're connected here, especially
Thank
on
you.
LinkedIn. What are
Yes.
some of the common, I know ADHD is very prevalent right now. What are some of the common
Mhm.
areas that you see frequently without, of course, releasing any personal information? What are some things you see
Yeah.
often, and maybe a tip or two for
Yeah.
people battling that?
I think insight into what really is happening, like the pulse right now of our conversations socially, socioculturally. So, in particular, certainly what I'm noticing is people really being attuned to executive functioning challenges when they often present with curiosity about, do I have ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, et cetera. And executive functioning in particular, what that means, those are skills that we utilize to self regulate and really to, for example, plan, organize, be able to manage our emotions in pursuit of kind of longer term goals. And so many individuals are presenting with those challenges and also curious about, do I seem to have this diagnosis, or is this more attributed to something that's happening in my environment and my context, such as, for example, excessive exposure to electronic devices, all those things that we're all struggling with as well societally. So it's an interesting time. There's a lot of information, of course, online, which is great, but sometimes, not always the most helpful either. It's helpful, like this podcast, fantastic. Sometimes too, that influx of information can be overwhelming for people. So I hear a lot of people also just kind of sharing a lot of what they're gaining from social media and just like trying to parse out what's actually happening, what's, maybe something that they're getting from online sources, and then also the executive functioning challenges that they're experiencing.
I love everything you said there, especially the challenges with being on the computer all day. There are certainly effects to that. So things I do is I take intentional walks just outside for 5 or 10 minutes. I live very close to the
Mhm.
beach intentionally, so I have my breaks throughout the day just a few minutes putting
Wonderful.
my feet in. And those are just some things that work for me when I do get stressed to improve my mental health. I always stress morning exercise. But for you, Irma, what are some
Yeah.
things you do to take care of your mental health?
Yeah, yeah. I love what you just shared, right? Like very fundamental
Mhm.
self-care oriented tasks that we can create as habits. To go back to your previous question as well, a tip I would give in terms of executive functioning challenges, generally speaking, would certainly be to try to understand what in particular you're struggling with. Is it, for example, inhibiting or pulling back from an urge or an impulse you have to do things?
Yeah.
That's what we call inhibition. Or alternatively, is it what we call working memory challenges, like holding and manipulating information in the mind? And then when you narrow that down, what the exact challenge is, try to develop or use a specific tool. So, for example, one that I like a lot is just being able to ground yourself. If you're having a hard time inhibiting, pulling back, I personally use this too. Is I try to ground myself with the five senses to the present moment and really ask myself, where is this like impulse or urge coming from?
Right.
And right, if it's coming from a place that's maybe not in service of the particular goal that I want to achieve, then I try to redirect, right? If it is in service of that particular goal or task, then I kind of go with it. So being able, yes, to try to be grounded with the five senses, taking in that present moment what you're experiencing, seeing, hearing, etc., is a great way to try to limit that impulsive response that many of us, I think, can sometimes struggle with.
I love how you're highlighting just to be mindful of these things. And I know that's half the battle sometimes. And
Mhm.
it's easier said than done, everyone. So don't be too hard on yourselves. And I always ask the guests some things that work for them because we're all different. Some things that work for me will not work for you, and vice versa. But Irma, you're doing so
Mhm.
much for the mental health field and for yourself. What's next for
Mhm.
you? What are you working on in 2025?
2025, certainly again, continuing that intersection of psychology in the workplace. So, a big passion of mine, in addition to working with individual clients, is working with organizations.
Mhm.
So, working, for example, with organizations that are really developing leaders or want to continue to help businesses develop. And so, being able to support them in that journey, I think psychology is such a fundamental part of that because it's really about self awareness, our connections with others. It's also about, to me, leading is really about developing and investing in others. And so that starts, though, first with developing and investing in ourselves and also understanding ourselves at this deep level. So it's all really psychological in nature. And like, I really want to continue to bring the two together, close that gap, and talk also about, things like positive psychology. How do we optimize our well-being? How do we optimize our strengths and using them? So those are conversations and things I'm really excited about in 2025. And yes, I have another location in Miami, so excited about that. And yeah, so the future is bright, as it looks for you too, Vincent. It looks like there's a lot of exciting things going on.
Yeah, you're too kind. And I know that we talked a little bit about ADHD and some things we can do to improve that directly. I know another big one is anxiety, at least on this podcast. It seems to be an
Mhm.
overarching struggle at some point in our guests' lives. What are some more generalized things people can do if they're struggling
Mhm.
from a severe anxiety, maybe even crippling,
Mhm.
where they're having trouble leaving the house, for example?
Yeah, I would say certainly normalizing. I first and foremost normalize a lot anxiety. It's one of the more pervasive, I think, experiences that we're having in this day and age. I would also say thinking of it as exposure being really important. So, of course, maybe you're familiar, and some of our listeners are familiar with exposure therapies, but those are some of my favorites to really tackle anxiety disorders and OCD, of course, but being able to view things as opportunities for exposure, but that you don't have to dive in all the way to exposing yourself to the things that you feel are very anxiety provoking. It can be something that's progressive. And so that's ideally when you're working with a therapist who's implementing like exposure with response prevention, they're going to help you create what's called a fear hierarchy. So you can slowly tackle your fears for particular situations or thoughts or stimuli and start to address those. So I would say viewing it that way is sometimes helpful, because what we'll want to do a lot with anxiety, myself included, is pull away and avoid certain scenarios, right? Certain thoughts, certain emotions. But then that just sustains the anxiety further. So changing our mindset in a way about it is key. And then working with someone ideally to try to tackle and confront some of those fears progressively is great too.
Well, we're going to ask how people can get in touch with you, if that is a good idea, in just a second. But I always like to close off the show where if you could please provide one piece of advice for anyone struggling today, right now, needs something new to hear, a new voice, what can you offer them?
Hope. Always there is hope. And in my journey through grief and loss, there were times when there was just a lot of like emptiness, feeling of not knowing if things could get better. And I'll share that through my work with clients and personally. There is hope for things to get better. Just believe in that first and foremost, and then also reach for the support systems in your life that hopefully can be there for you. And then, seek someone that you trust to work through with in those things that you're struggling with. But of course, hope is, I think, something that we need as human beings, and something that's within us deep inside, as well as just a desire to continue forward.
A great last word. But since we just spoke about it again, speaking to someone similar to what you do, what are some tips you can offer for people to maybe find the right fit? As I know,
Mhm.
therapy is not a one size fits all.
Yeah, definitely a lot of factors: personality, approach. I think the specific presenting concern. Those are some considerations I would recommend. Have, if you can, an initial consult. Many psychologists will offer that. So have an initial consult, see what the conversation can feel like, and think about too the questions that you want to ask in terms of what's important to you in the process. For example, if it's important to get tools and like help with problem solving, ask about that, like how maybe the psychologist, therapist does that. And then get a feel, for kind of that personality as well, in terms of during the conversation, or even through things that you might find online about the psychologist. And so thinking about that holistic fit, I think, is really helpful to your point.
Absolutely amazing advice. We don't want to force anything. We want that nice organic fit. And with that, I have to thank Irma so much for taking the time to join our mental health community. Where can we find you online? Where can we request your services? Everything in between.
Yeah, you can find me online, icpstampa.com, as well as latinasleading.com. So icpstampa.com is our psychological site, and then latinasleading.com is our leadership, organizational development, and business management consulting site. You can also find me online on LinkedIn, Dr. Irma Campos, as well as on Instagram, Dr. Irma Campos, and happy to connect and answer any questions that anyone has at any point. So thank you so much, Vincent. This was so fun and went by so fast, just flew by.
The conversations tend to flow well when they're organic, like we said, when we're not forcing a podcast chat. And everyone, don't give up on your cold outreach or cold networking. If you don't want to pick up the phone, that's okay. At least do cold messaging and cold outworking, because it brought a great guest here to the show. Everyone, be sure to check her out, ICPS. And my name is Vincent A. Lancy. You can find me online and on social media with my name. The show is brought to you by John Ford, doing great things with his empathy card set, empathy app, johnford.com, empathyset.com. And my name is Vincent A. Lancy once again. Be sure to subscribe for the next episode next week. And today we're signing off right here in the Tampa Bay area. Irma, thank you so much.
Thank you, Vincent. Awesome to be here.